Alexander Borodin was in disbelief when his young daughter Gania asked him to play a piano duet with her. "But you do not know how to play, my child," he said. "Yes, indeed," she protested, "I can play this." And she proceeded to plunk out a kind of inside-out C major scale using one finger from each hand. This was known in Russia as the cutlet polka, as in chopped meat, and it was apparently popular with children who could easily chop out the piece with vertical hands. A published version of it appeared around the same time in Scotland as the celebrated chop waltz, suggesting that it was a widespread phenomenon, one that would later become known in English as chopsticks. The third section of this waltz was similar to the Russian version that Gania had learned how to play. Borodin was intrigued by his daughter's invitation, so he sat down next to her at the piano as she played her solo over and over again. Inspiration struck, and he improvised a polka accompaniment with a melody that fit almost too perfectly beneath Gania's part. But how could he keep the music going? He couldn't ask his daughter to play anything else, she only knew the cutlet polka. So, for a little variety, he changed the key of his accompaniment from C major to G major. He followed with a short trio in F major, another section in A minor, and a coda to wrap it all up. Incredibly, Borodin had just played an entire duet with his daughter despite the fact that she had never had a piano lesson in her life. He wrote down the polka and held on to it for a few years, eventually revealing it to his composer friends in 1878. His colleagues were well accustomed to sharing ideas. As leaders of the modern Russian school of music, they took their work very seriously. But when Rimsky-Korsakov, Cui, and Lyadov gathered around the piano to hear Borodin play his little polka on the cutlet theme, they couldn't stop laughing. Rimsky-Korsakov immediately saw the potential in this exercise, so he suggested turning it into a kind of friendly competition. Each composer would write as many variations as he could underneath this repeated idea. There was just one rule. No one could alter the original material on the top line, what they called their cantus firmus, or fixed song. Any changes in key, meter, or rhythm were forbidden unless they only took place in the part below it. Despite these constraints, the ideas soon began to flow as they pieced together a suite of variations. Some variations strayed into remote key areas. Some were eccentric. Some sounded very Russian. For most composers, it would have stopped there, after 24 miniature variations totaling about 7 minutes in performance. But this was a competitive group. One by one, each composer tried to outdo his colleagues by writing full-scale character pieces. They tried modern dances. And old-fashioned dances. Even folk dances. Not to be outdone at his own game, Borodin had composed 2 pieces that took the parody to a new level. One was a funeral march with foreboding drum rolls in the bass, but the most outrageous variation was his Requiem for imaginary organ and singers, complete with authentic lyrics from the Latin Mass text. It begins with an imitation of an organ prelude in the ancient church style. Then a mock liturgical chant appears, one that would have been familiar to Mozart, Handel, and Bach, all of whom had set versions of this melody, which originally came from a 1588 Protestant funeral hymn. Mozart had most famously adapted it at the beginning of his own Requiem. A century later, Borodin was paraphrasing it as a fugue underneath Russian chopsticks. Even Tchaikovsky, who derided this project as artistically void, had to admit that Borodin's Requiem was a remarkably successful trick. As these composers were inventing the most absurd accompaniments for this simple tune, they tried to enlist more of their colleagues. Balakirev, one of the more serious personalities in their group, was violently opposed to the idea. Rimsky-Korsakov recalled that he was indignant at us for engaging in such nonsense, printing them and showing them off. They also asked Mussorgsky, who relented and showed up one day with his own variation, but he had misunderstood the assignment and changed the motif according to his inspiration. The others insisted that he had done it incorrectly and had to rewrite it, but Mussorgsky just refused to cooperate. One day, Rimsky-Korsakov sat down at the piano to demonstrate a newly composed fugue for QE. Its subject was based on a famous theme, B-A-C-H, 4 adjacent notes on the keyboard. Originally used more than a century earlier by Bach himself, this was a difficult fugue subject to work with and required an expert to pull it off. So when Rimsky-Korsakov revealed his own Bach fugue, QE was unimpressed. It was only when he told his colleague to pluck out the notes of the cutlet polka while he played the fugue again that QE could not hide his amazement. The contrapuntal ideas didn't stop there. In another variation, the ostinato becomes a grotesque fugue subject in itself. Rimsky-Korsakov also recognized the ostinato as a convincing bell motif, as if it were part of a carillon. This carillon variation calls for up to 5 hands to ring all the bells at once. The project grew to a whopping 24 variations and a finale, plus 15 character pieces to make for over 30 minutes of music on Russian chopsticks. That's significantly longer than Beethoven's Eroica variations or Brahms's Handel variations. Rimsky-Korsakov apparently had even more ideas that didn't make the cut, including a sonatina, a version of the chorale Ein fester Burg, and a recitative in the style of J.S. Bach, among others. When the work was published under the title Paraphrases in 1879, it drew immediate attention, and much of it was not good. Tchaikovsky recorded his brutal assessment in a letter that year. The work is, of course, original in its way, and reveals in the author's remarkable abilities in harmonization, but it is not to my taste. As a joke, it is too heavy, bulky, and indigestible, owing to the intrusiveness of the endless repetition of the theme. As an artistic work, it is a 0. It is not surprising that several talented people, for their own amusement, set themselves the task of inventing every possible variation on a vulgar tavern tune. But what is surprising is that these dilettantish trifles are printed and made public. Only dilettantes could think that every piquantly contrived little chord is worthy of publication. Tchaikovsky may have had high standards, but there were other notable musicians who disagreed with him. The paraphrases found their way into the hands of the nearly 70-year-old Franz Liszt, who wrote to a friend in St. Petersburg of his fondness for this humorous work. In fact, it had amused him to play it with his pupils. But when news of Liszt's approval reached the press, the critics attacked. Our enemies were infuriated, Borodin recalled. They said that Liszt could not have approved of such a work, that he never wrote the letter, that the whole thing was a falsehood, and finally that we composers had compromised ourselves by the publication of such a work. Tchaikovsky, too, had doubted the sincerity of Liszt's praise. But as Borodin recounted, when Liszt heard all this, he laughed heartily. He wrote to us, "If this work is considered compromising, let me compromise myself with you." It was then that he sent the scrap of music that serves as an introduction to my polka. Our enemies were silenced. Though this project was ultimately a success, its composers had taken risks in making it public. When Saint-Saëns composed his humorous Carnival of the Animals suite in 1886, he withheld its publication, except for the Swan movement, for the last 30 years of his life, fearing that his reputation as a serious composer might be ruined if the music became widely known. But these Russian composers were clearly unafraid of such an outcome. They saw value in the creative exercise imposed by the ceaseless motif. They took this constraint very seriously and insisted that others join their quest in wringing out all its possibilities. And of course, they had fun with it too. The joke was well received by our friends, Borodin recalled. We amused ourselves by performing these things with people who could not play the piano. The final expansion of the project appeared in 1893 with a 7-page supplement of new variations by Nikolai Scherbatov. Later on, at least 2 20th century orchestrations brought this music to more audiences through concerts and commercial recordings. It's unclear whether Borodin's daughter Gania ever pursued formal music studies, but we can say that thanks to the efforts of her father and his friends, she went on to command an impressively varied piano repertoire.